So you go back to the initial question of does metabolism drop during menopause enough effectively to explain weight gain? No, it doesn't. Not in on itself. However, the question of does menopause change where fat is stored? Absolutely yes. Welcome back to another episode of the Smart Strength Training podcast. Now, this is podcast episode 48. One of the bits of feedback I get from my podcast that people like is that I keep them short, sort of 10, 15 minutes. And if you glance down at the timestamps on this, it's going to be a lot longer because I'm going to cover a topic that's very, very detailed and there's lots of nuance, which is menopause, metabolism, and weight gain. So because of the complexities of this topic, I think it's important that I give it time. I was thinking about breaking it down into a series, but then I thought, no, I like the idea of being able to give the science and give the sort of blueprint of what to do in one hit rather than sort of like making you wait across sort of 3 podcasts across 6 weeks. Okay, so let's go. So first up, I kind of a disclaimer, I guess. This topic is of a particular interest to me personally. It affects my entire client base as I work exclusively with women. But at the same time, I'm very mindful that I'm a male personal trainer speaking about something that sits within the female space. So it's important to acknowledge that because often where the research sits in this area doesn't 100% line up with the anecdotes and the lived experience that women will share around menopause. So respecting that, I want to make sure I come in, like I always do on episodes, with I just want to talk about the evidence-based and the science to give you a really clear outline of what the evidence tells us currently. I also want to be really clear from the start, there is huge variability. Every single woman coming into menopause has a different training history, her lifestyle leading into menopause, the severity of her symptoms, of the environment that she lived in, and all these other factors are going to be very, very unique to her, which makes like that context makes generalizing advice always really hard. And that's why sometimes trying to oversimplify things doesn't usually help. So I want to go into the science and I'll try and simplify it to the best of my ability, but I also want to make sure that you really understand what's happening in your body and more importantly, what you can do about it in the long run. So the first big question, or I guess the biggest question, is does metabolism slow down around menopause? And is it that slowing down of metabolic rate that is causative of weight gain? I think before we can answer this, it's super important that we define metabolism. So I have to read this off script because this is the definition of metabolism. So metabolism is the sum of all the chemical reactions in your body that keep you alive. It's the process of converting food and stored energy into fuel your cells need for everything from breathing to circulating blood and repairing tissue and thinking. In basic terms, metabolism is the energy that your organs use to keep you alive. Your brain uses something like 20% of the overall energy requirements that your body has day to day. Your liver is constantly processing nutrients, removing waste products, and it's a massive, massive energy user. Your heart beats over 100,000 times per day. Your kidneys are constantly filtering blood throughout the day, and your muscles, even at rest, they don't burn as much energy as those organs, but your muscle system, the organ tissue that is muscle, is huge. And it's a major contributor to metabolism. So when we're talking about a slowing of metabolic rate, I think it's really important that we keep in our mind exactly what metabolism is, because sometimes you look across social media or you read in books, metabolism can be sort of almost made out to be something a bit more mystical, like it slows down, speeds up, and certainly to try and slow down metabolism or speed up rapidly isn't actually something that we can really do. So let's then talk about, let's look at the science effectively into slowing metabolic rates during a life cycle. So someone to be aware of in the sort of science space in this topic of energy expenditure is Herman Ponce. He is an evolutionary anthropologist. He works out of Duke University in North Carolina. He is the author of the book Burn, which is titled The Misunderstood Science Around Metabolism. And he's best known for his research into bioenergetics, which basically puts him slap bang in the middle of the best person effectively to answer this question. He also led a huge study that was published in the journal Science in 2021, which looked at metabolism across an entire human lifespan. Now, the data source that he created in this, or his team created in this study, was massive. They used pooled data using doubly labeled water, which is the gold standard method for measuring total daily energy expenditure in free living humans. So to explain what the hell double labeled water is, effectively scientists give a water drink, which contains both hydrogen and oxygen atoms, and they are labeled with safe, non-radioactive isotopes. And as your body uses energy, you breathe out carbon dioxide and you lose water through sweat, through urine, and through the breath. And then by measuring how fast those labeled atoms leave the body, hydrogen leaves only through water, oxygen leaves through both water and carbon dioxide. So researchers can calculate how much carbon dioxide you produce, and since carbon dioxide production is directly tied to energy expenditure, they can work out exactly how many calories you burn every day. The sample size for this research paper was massive. 6,400 people going from infancy all the way through to old age. So the scale and the time course of this research is huge, which is why the findings are so strong. So what were the key findings to this particular research paper? So they found that energy expenditure, when adjusted for fat-free mass, is remarkably stable from the age of 20 all the way through to 60, which means that in answering the question about metabolism through menopause, there was no detectable dip in metabolic rate during the menopausal years. Metabolism only seems to start declining, like at a population-based level, from the age of 60 years and beyond. And in Ponder's words, and in his conclusion, he says that the engine of metabolism stays stable. But let's just justify, or let's just clarify what that really means. This basically means that the energy that's burnt per unit of lean tissue stays stable. And that hopefully makes sense. So your organs are not slowing down significantly during a life cycle overall. I stated as well that they adjusted for fat-free mass. So they adjusted in the research for losses in muscle tissue. And that's really, really important to state when we move into the next data set to look at. And I guess to answer the question then, so we'll park the question and come back to it around, does metabolism slow down? I'll answer that sort of directly in a moment. Does metabolism slow down during menopause? The other question, of course, is, are there changes in regional fat storage during menopause? So to answer this, the really good place to look is at the SWAN data set. And this information, I think, is useful to know exists. SWAN stands for the study of women's health across the nation. It's a large, ongoing, longitudinal cohort that follows thousands of women across different ethnicities across their entire life. But for the context of what we're looking at, it's across midlife that we're going to be looking at. And what makes SWAN so powerful is the duration of the follow-up and their ability to align their data set to the period we really care about, which is the final menstrual period. This allows researchers to look at the changes due to chronological age and then changes that are specific to the menopause transition itself. And in this data set, one of the branches of the data set use DEXA scans. So that effectively is the gold standard when it comes to body composition analysis. And DEXA can very reliably track fat-free mass and lean mass plus bone mineral density as well. And again, this is a large-scale study. So we've got a really high-quality tool to measure what we're after, like a large population size across a long period of time. So in the SWAN data set, women were scanned across multiple sites over many ages, giving a really detailed picture of what happens or what changes in fat mass and lean mass occur through the transition window. So let's go through the key findings to this. So in the research, they stated that there's a critical window of around 2 years before and 2 years after the final menstrual period. So that's around 4 to 5 years in total. During this window, the rate of fat mass gain nearly doubles. Doesn't mean that your body fat doubles. It means that the rate in which a woman's gaining fat doubles across that time compared to earlier in midlife. And on average, in the SWAN data set, women gained around 1.6 kilos of body fat. And paired with that, lean mass declined across the same period. On average, women lost between zero point 0.2 and zero point 0.3 kilos of muscle tissue across that. But it's important to state that weight itself didn't just spike. It was a continuous, slow, steady increase across that 4 to 5 year period. But the key issue here is the shift in body composition. Lean mass was reduced and more fat mass accumulated, especially more fat mass around the abdomen and also specifically visceral fat around the internal organs. And within that SWAN data set, the heart sub-study showed that visceral fat around the organs, as mentioned, increased sharply during that menopause transition. And this matters because visceral fat is linked to higher risk of heart disease, like insulin resistance. So when women notice more belly fat, it's not just skin fold fat, it's also that visceral fat as well. So from the SWAN data set, we can see that the menopause transition is associated to redistribution of tissue. So rather than it being a sharp change in body weight, this redistribution really explains or certainly suggests why a lot of women notice that loss of muscle tone, increase in belly fat overall, and just a sense of it's harder to manage body shape. So at first glance, it sounds like the Ponza data actually is the opposite to SWAN data. But it's not. Ponza simply states that metabolism doesn't change through life, that it stays very stable. So the energy that your organs are burning, that are the primary driver of metabolism, don't change. Ponza also adjusts for changes in fat-free mass. So when people lost muscle, that was adjusted for in the calculation in the research. Whereas SWAN shows that women lose lean mass and gain fat mass through menopause. So both absolutely correct. Ponza's work adjusts for that fat-free mass, and it's just saying that muscle tissue and metabolism doesn't change the amount of energy that it burns. But the SWAN data set shows us that muscle tissue is lost, and therefore absolute metabolic rate will drop slightly due to that. But it is worth stating that the reduction in lean tissue was actually quite small. If you heard me say that it was a 0.2 to 0.3 kilos of muscle tissue, and that equates to about 3 to 5 calories per day. So that's not necessarily enough in itself to explain the weight gain in isolation. So you go back to the initial question of does metabolism drop during menopause enough effectively to explain weight gain? No, it doesn't. Not in on itself. However, the question of does menopause change where fat is stored? Absolutely yes. And I think the lived experience massively shows that. Every single woman will state, or certainly a majority of women going through menopause will state that. So I think it's really clear that we explain some of the kind of like rationale and the science behind why that redistribution happens, specifically, or hormones, specifically estrogen is why it happens. So estrogen normally helps stimulate muscle protein synthesis. It promotes lipid oxidation and regulates where fat is stored. So at first, in like early life, favoring the hips and the thighs rather than the abdomen. It also influences appetite and satiety hormones, so leptin and ghrelin. And then with declining estrogen, muscle maintenance signals are weakening, so therefore we have a loss of lean muscle tissue. And then this fat storage shifts towards more central fat around midsection and more visceral fat overall. Going back into the conversation around losses in muscle tissue, peak muscle mass and strength occur between 20 and 30. And then there is a gradual decline in strength overall. One of the things that's really hard in this topic is you often hear people say that adults start losing muscle at a rate of 1% from 30, which is a very simplistic view of how muscle tissue reduces, because someone's exercise habits will massively influence that. Someone could quite happily and very much so gain muscle from 30 through to 50, no problem at all. That 1% reduction is such an oversimplistic view. But you have to state that someone could be not working out from the age of 30 and then starting to have a gradual reduction in muscle tissue because they are so sedentary across a life cycle. And then you think normal menopause, like age range, is 45 to 55. Currently in the UK, the average age of menopause for women is 51, and in the United States it's 52. So you could have a situation where if a woman wasn't working out in her 30s and she gets to 50, you would have 20 years of slow reduction in muscle tissue up to that point, paired with that hitting that transitional period where there is a slight increase in the rate in which muscle tissue is lost, paired with that body fat redistribution. Coming back to that very, very first thing that I said, which is the challenge in this topic, is you can't give broad strokes advice because every woman's life is different coming into menopause. We're talking about a history of 45, 50 years to that point, which is all valid and all needs to be taken into consideration if you're going to give advice about it overall. Next, let's talk about, I promise you I will get on to what to do about this. Let's talk about menopause symptoms. Specifically, I want to talk about the symptoms that are going to affect the topic of effective energy expenditure and energy intake. So that's the vasomotor symptoms. So hot flushes, night sweats, they are the kind of hallmarks of menopause. They, of course, can disrupt sleep quality and duration. Poor sleep is going to lead to more daytime to fatigue, a lower motivation to train, less NEAT, so less sort of spontaneous activity overall. It's also going to increase appetite and cravings due to those hormones, leptin and ghrelin. Sleep disruption is also going to affect recovery. So poor recovery from training makes it hard to maintain high intensity levels in a workout. That's going to affect strength and progress overall, and also affect energy expenditure from that particular bout of working out. And chronic sleep debt is also linked to reduced glucose tolerance and decreased insulin sensitivity, which can make fat loss harder as well. Add on top of this, the sort of mood symptoms, so anxiety, low mood, irritability, that can reduce the adherence to a nutritional plan or a training program overall, and also can affect more emotional triggered eating patterns, which can increase energy intake. And then finally, joint pain, which is usually common during the transitional period. Pain is definitely going to impact someone's desire to train, willingness to engage in any kind of resistance training or high impact form of exercise overall. And that can indirectly affect that muscle loss, which could also then indirectly affect fat gain. But again, these symptoms don't slow metabolism directly, but they create an environment where less sleep equals less activity, more appetite, and then more fatigue creates fewer calories burnt through exercise, and changes in mood are going to make it very hard to stick to the routine overall. So those things together can make it so that it's quite easy to drift with habits effectively. And someone could start moving into a situation where they are consuming a few more calories than they realize, and that could drive fat gain. And again, can I come to like a sensitive point, I guess. Menopause is such a personal lived experience. And it's really, really hard because obviously many women will say, I'm doing everything exactly the same and now I'm gaining fat around the midsection. And anecdotes can be really tricky. So we know that from that menopause transition, there's huge variability of what's going on. We've got hormones that are shifting. Sleep can be disrupted by night sweats. Mood changes affect appetite. Joint pain can affect exercise overall. And then there'll be a lot of unconscious choices that just sort of quietly tip the balance. So an example of this, if sleep is disrupted and you wake up a bit more tired than normal, you just move a bit less throughout the day, maybe 1,000 less steps. And you wake up early, so the appetite is a bit higher, and you just have a few more calories throughout the day, say 100 calories throughout the day. And you layer that over weeks and months, and that all adds up. So they will definitely feel like you're doing exactly the same thing. And it's not about discipline and diligence, because a lot of this stuff is invisible. It's the symptoms and the lifestyle just changing together, which I think is why the research is so important. The SWAN data set specifically is so valuable. It shows us on average what's happening across thousands of women, help us better understand what's happening, because it's quite hard to sort of spot in the day-to-day really what is going on. Okay, now it's the important bit. So we know what the research says around those two kind of like key topics, around body fat distribution, or three topics: body fat distribution, changes in metabolism overall, and the menopause symptoms, creating an environment making it very hard to stick to. So, or to stick to sort of like habits overall. So, what can you do about it? So, as I've mentioned repeated times now, that the environment that menopause symptoms themselves create, so poor sleep, fatigue, mood changes, um, that's going to affect energy balance. That's going to affect how much energy you have overall. So, the kind of classic thing that women will do is diet harder. Like, you notice that you've gained some body fat around your midsection and you default to your normal patterns, which might be go and do a few more runs per week, go and book an extra class, or I'm going to cut carbs out. But effectively, you're in an environment, a situation where poor sleep, fatigue is affecting energy overall. And now we're layering in hard workouts, more calories burned. That's going to dysregulate energy even more. Um, and this is why timing can really matter. Um, let's say you're going through a period during the menopause transition where you feel pretty good, energy's pretty good. And I don't want to HRT is obviously a huge topic in this space. And this is going to be a long podcast anyway without going to HRT. That's going to be a separate one in itself. But if a woman can do HRT to manage those symptoms, that creates potentially a window opportunity to actually do things, train a bit harder, adhere to nutrition plans slightly better. Because for any woman that's trying to adhere to changing their diet or altering their exercise habits in that environment that makes it very hard to stick to, like, it's the worst scenario. And you're going to be fighting fluctuations in energy. And it's quite impressive that women are able to like out willpower these things overall. But at some point in time, biology is going to win. And it might make sense to not come at it too hard. I need to cover this topic because it's circulating on social media so much at the moment. So there's this thought that for calories in, calories out for women over 50 is nonsense. It doesn't work anymore. There's a lot of talk about how the architecture of the hypothalamus alters in later life. Now, this is certainly evident in rodent data, and certainly in the human data that we do have, it does show some change. It's quite a large leap in assumptions to then jump to the conclusion that calories in, calories out doesn't work at all for an entire demographic of people. I've touched a whole podcast episode on the issues with calories in, calories out. So just really quickly to summarize, if you hear that and you say, Andy, you're talking crap, calories in, calories out doesn't work, then you are right to a point, in the sense that it's so hard, borderline impossible, to calculate how much energy you consume through food. Just simple things like obviously human error. Also, there's a 20% error margin in food labeling. So you could be consuming way more or way fewer calories than the label actually tells you in the first place. Every single human being is going to absorb a different amount of food from a different amount of energy from food. So we know from an energy in standpoint, it's borderline impossible. It's not impossible. There are good calculations, but we don't have access to those as sort of mere mortals and outside of being in a laboratory setting. And then trying to track and measure caloric expenditure through movement is as variable, if not more variable. This sort of like fitness tech really can't, like Apple Watches, that kind of thing, really can't calculate caloric expenditure. Hugely variable, super hard figure to land on. So if someone's saying to me, I've tried to track calories and work out how many calories I burnt, it didn't work. Yeah, I'm 100% on board with that. It's nonsense. It won't work. That doesn't mean that the energy balance of the body doesn't still become the primary driver of fat loss for anyone. But as I mentioned, you're coming into the transition window through menopause with dysregulation in energy overall. So a small energy deficit is going to work much, much better than an aggressive one. This preserves energy for training and reduces the risk of sort of rebounding into overeating patterns. I also mentioned just earlier, just to be flexible with it. Some periods are just not going to suit being in a deficit. You might need to, if you notice your sleep starts to get poor and it's just really hard to stick to it, you might need to start purposely eating a bit more food to get through that period whilst the symptoms have flared up before going back into a period where you do try and drop into a deficit. Overall, as I mentioned, like trying to out willpower this is incredible that women can do it and try and do it, but it's not a long-term solution at some point in time. As I mentioned, biology will win in the end. Obviously, protein is a non-negotiable. This helps to maintain muscle tissue. We know how important muscle tissue is. It also helps keep us full. Fiber also, if that topic is also really important. As I sort of mentioned, calories in, calories out. Should people track their food intake? I mean, again, that could be a whole podcast episode on itself. But I would say if someone was weight stable coming into the menopause transition and they noticed that they started to have gains in overall fat mass as well as that changes in body fat, then you're probably, because you were weight stable prior, you could just probably tweak things that you were doing and that might be effective. If someone's body weight was yo-yoing a lot before they even came into the menopause transition, there's a bigger question in there that potentially tracking could be useful, could create some awareness. And again, we go back to that. The challenge here is the lived experience that a woman's life leading up to the transition years makes this a really, really complex topic to talk about. So resistance training, unsurprisingly, we're going to talk about resistance training. We've spoken about how important building lean muscle mass is, or there's this reduction in muscle mass, and we want to make sure we preserve lean muscle mass. So your primary goal during menopause is resistance training. We want hard, focused work. We want progression, and we want work that is done close to your limit. Now, I've already said energy is going to be dysregulated due to symptoms, which is why quality beats quantity. Better to do 2 to 3 purposeful sessions for 30 to 45 minutes where you really push each set close to the point of task failure than you trying to cram in 8 exercises in a circuit fashion. Because again, you want to respect the energy that you're burning in a workout and you want to lay down muscle tissue, and doing circuits and stuff like that isn't going to do it. Ultimately, recovery really matters. Your energy really matters. And if energy is low, you might need to cut your workouts a bit shorter that day. If energy is high, you can push hard, you can do more total work. So again, just being a bit flexible with your nutrition strategy overall, sometimes going to maintenance, sometimes being in a deficit. And then also with your workouts, not always just doing the exact same thing all the time, and respecting your energy, your sleep, and your mood overall, and your ability to train. Obviously, overall activity is important. It's hugely valuable for health and for energy balance, but more isn't always better. One of the things to state, I've touched on this on a previous podcast episode, and you might have heard me talk about it on social media, that there's something called the constrained energy model. And this basically means, in the most simple terms, that if you do 2 times as much cardio, you do not burn 2 times as much energy. Per unit of time, it's not the same. The body can adapt. There is a constrained amount of energy your body can utilize per day with exercise or from exercise. As I mentioned, this is a topic I've discussed on a previous podcast. Also worth stating that the constrained energy model is a model that came from Herman Pontz's work. So it is safe to say that that book, Burn, is a really useful read for anyone that wants to know more about metabolism overall. So let's discuss the cardio. What kinds of cardio should we be doing? So again, of course, I want to hammer home the same thing all the time, but if you're in a period where sleep is poor, energy is dysregulated, then of course it would make more sense to do steady state cardio, sort of long duration, steady cardiovascular training. But for a lot of women, like the menopause transitional years comes across a period of their life where potentially they've got lots of things going on with kids. Time is just not something they've got tons of. So doing more steady state cardio probably isn't going to be the sort of thing they can practically do anyway. So in that situation, doing more short bursts of hard work, like sprint interval training or actual high intense interval. So 10 to 30 seconds maximum for 4 to 12 repeats on some sort of low skill equipment, like a bike, a rower, a treadmill, if your joints will allow it. Not that kind of like pseudo intervals, sort of like Joe Wicks popularized and the stuff that I was criticizing, we were all criticizing 10 years ago. So kettlebell swings and burpees, that kind of stuff. That's just a circuit. That's just burning energy. And that's not what we want. We want purposeful work that's going to give a signal to your body to lay down more muscle tissue, to actually make structural changes that make your body more efficient overall. So proper interval training, low skill equipment. I do really appreciate that some people don't have access to low skill equipment and don't have access to a gym. So again, the lived experience is very different per woman. But again, you can lean more into just staying active overall, can be very, very useful. Just because I mentioned intervals, and again, if you've been in and around the menopause discussion on social media, you might have come across this idea that high intensity interval training can reduce visceral fat, even in a situation where there wasn't a dietary intervention, so there wasn't a calorie restriction, which is certainly some exciting research. What I would say is there are some limitations to this research. The sample sizes are quite small. They're done over relatively short durations, but some of the evidence does suggest that these short bursts, these high intense intervals, these sprint intervals could be a useful tool for impacting visceral fat. But it is super important not to overstate what exercise can do. Exercise as a driver by itself, as a single modality that you do, isn't going to have a huge influence on fat loss. These research findings are promising. I've, of course, seen lots of influencers exaggerate the effect size. High intense interval training is not some sort of magic bullet when it comes to losing body fat, but it's certainly a valid option when it comes to a broader approach as we're going through now, when it comes to your options towards body fat loss during menopause. And most importantly, the activity you're doing should support your energy, not drain it. So if you're increasing your steps, you're doing more cardio, and it's worsening your symptoms from menopause, or you're just getting hungry and more fatigued, then you need to adjust. Like, doing less might sound counterintuitive, but respecting the energy that your body is going to be able to put aside for exercise is super, super important. Okay. The next one is probably the hardest one, which is to be patient. Because obviously, I touched on earlier that changes to regional body fat will occur across a 2 to 5 year period. Let's say that's a pretty short period of time, like to start noticing. And I talk to women all the time. And it's like, hey, across 6 months or across a year, I've already noticed these changes. That's really upsetting. Of course, that's going to be really upsetting. And the natural thing to do is to double down on nutrition, adopt some really restrictive strategies and eating patterns overall, to push your workouts harder, more sessions, longer workouts, higher step count. And like I've mentioned, in the context of symptoms with energy fluctuations, this isn't the smartest thing to do. So taking a longer term approach with this is really, really smart. Resistance train, like build muscle, that should be the cornerstone of any strategy around menopause. The reality is, as I've touched on a podcast before, muscle gain is slow. It's measured in years, not weeks. That's not something most women want to hear, but it's important to understand, to maybe just make peace with anything you do rapidly could really negatively influence your ability to stick to what you're doing overall. And one of the things I would state as well, and again, this is easy for me to sort of discuss as a kind of contextualized topic rather than actually in the lived world, is stabilizing body weight. So if you've noticed some fat accumulation and you just don't have the mental bandwidth to diet, making smart swaps to just keep weight stable, stop the accumulation of body fat, spending some time just kind of like getting your eating just a little bit more on point, keeping your exercise habits just pretty stable, and don't make drastic changes, can be really, really helpful. Because as mentioned, that critical window of around 4 years, trying to fight that can really backfire. So you want to be as sustainable as possible with it, cover all your bases with strength training. Activity overall is the really kind of most effective way forward. Okay, so to wrap this up, menopause doesn't crash your metabolism suddenly, but it does create a perfect storm with changes in body fat distribution, in a slight reduction in muscle mass, potentially paired with, if there's been years of inactivity leading up to menopause, a maybe more accelerated decrease in muscle tissue overall. And then the symptoms creating lifestyle challenges that can just tip the balance in a direction of fat gain overall. The science really gives us the big picture, but of course, every woman's lived experience is going to be different, which means every woman's blueprint needs to be slightly different. Resistance training has to be at the forefront of what you do. Smart nutrition, where you're actually paying attention to your energy and not trying to fight like crazy to lose body fat in a situation where your energy is all over the place. Anyway, you need to make sure that you can recover from what you're doing. Don't think that more is always better, and patience is key. I appreciate that it's a very, very easiest for as a man to sit here and say, be patient. That's a very hard thing to do when your body is doing things that you're not used to it doing. And effectively, all the things that you're used to doing that would work are no longer working. And like I mentioned as well, that's what I touched on briefly, but didn't want to go over too much. If the symptoms really are disruptive, the menopause symptoms really are disruptive, then speaking to a healthcare provider around your options with HRT can create a environment where you can push a bit harder, make focus on a diet a little bit more, that you can be a bit more diligent with it overall. Can be very, very useful. So that wasn't short and concise, but it was as long as I think I needed it to be to cover all the key topics. There are still some bits in there that I would like to have dived into in a bit more detail. So I am still aware that I've sort of brushed over a few of them quite quickly, but hopefully that gave you everything you need to know. And as I mentioned, I work with women all the time, helping them understand the best thing to do with nutrition and the training during menopause and after. So if you need help with this, I am available for online personal training.